Hi guys, this is the third video in our series looking at unemployment, and in this video we're going to be looking at the concept of real wage unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. This is probably the section of unemployment that most pupils find by far the most difficult, because we're going to meet a whole load of terms and working out how they all fit together with what we've already seen is really tricky. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a really clear idea of how it all works. We're going to go into quite a lot of detail, but hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a really crystal clear idea of how these different concepts of unemployment fit together in what is one of the most tricky topics in the A-level. Let's start with an overview of what we've seen so far with unemployment. We spoke firstly about the ways we measure unemployment, but much more interestingly we spoke about the different causes or types of unemployment. We spoke about seasonal, frictional, structural and cyclical unemployment. And hopefully, by the time you're watching this video, you're happy with those 4 different causes. If you're not, go back and watch the previous video in the playlist. Seasonal, frictional and structural we speak of as supply-side unemployment. They're all about the supply of labour to the market. We're going to see that we can think of them usually as voluntary unemployment, as equilibrium unemployment, and as the natural rate. 4 terms that we're going to meet in this video, all of which link back to these 3. Cyclical unemployment, on the other hand, is demand side, involuntary and disequilibrium unemployment. And this idea of disequilibrium unemployment, which we're going to meet today, is also known as real wage unemployment. And we're going to overview all of these terms and keep going back to this framework of how they fit together. Let's start with real wage unemployment. Real wage unemployment, crucially, is a different perspective on unemployment. It's the idea that unemployment can be caused by the wage in the labour market failing to adjust to equilibrium. The wage is too high. It's usually viewed as it's a classical view of unemployment, but we'll see that it's been incorporated into more interventionist Keynesian frameworks as well. This is a labour market. Now, we've not drawn these diagrams before in macro, so just note that we're not dealing with a standard ADAS diagram. On the vertical axis, we've got the wage, and on the horizontal axis, we've got the quantity of workers. And we're dealing with the whole economy's labour market, so we're thinking the total number of workers in the whole economy and the average wage in the whole economy. Here's a market that is in equilibrium. Real wage unemployment exists when the wage is above this level. If the wage goes above this level, the demand for workers from firms contracts to L2. And the number of workers willing to work will extend to L3, and the resulting gap is unemployment. It's known also as disequilibrium unemployment. The labour market isn't in equilibrium. Just by way of context, here's some data on the UK. Quite confusing, but let's break it down. The purple line is UK unemployment over the past 20 years. The red line is real average wages per week, and the blue line is nominal wages. Now we can see that since 2008, real wages slowly fell as unemployment rose, and that's what we would expect to see if the market is adjusting properly, that when there's high unemployment, wages are slowly pushed downwards. But the fact there was high unemployment for such a long time suggests that there was some real wage unemployment. Wages were too high, and therefore there was excess supply of labour. That's what's going on in our diagram. The supply of labour is too great. There's excess supply of labour, we want wages to adjust downwards. So here's the key question: why could this happen? What causes this? Well, there's 5 basic reasons that different economists have pointed to why real wages might be too high. The first is trade unions. Trade unions are when workers group together to bargain for higher wages in a process known as collective bargaining. It's not so significant anymore in the UK, only about 23% of workers are in trade unions. It's much more significant in some industries than others, and it tends to be more significant in the public sector. But historically, trade unions have been quite powerful, and trade unions have the effect of pushing wages up, which can cause real wage unemployment. Much more significant is the national minimum wage, which is a legal minimum floor for wages. It is illegal to pay somebody less than the national minimum wage, which is £8.72 as of April 2020. There are different rates for different ages. The higher the national minimum wages, the more wages are pushed up, and therefore it might cause real wage unemployment. Unemployment benefits have the same effect. They're an effective floor for wages because employers can't pay their workers less than what their workers would receive if they weren't working. If workers could receive a couple of £100 a week in unemployment benefits, I can't get away with paying them less than that, or there's no incentive to work. And that links back to our replacement ratio that we met in our last video, the ratio of disposable income in work to disposable income out of work. Two more slightly specific ideas. One is the efficiency wage hypothesis. This is quite a complex little theory. It's the idea that firms may deliberately keep their wages above the equilibrium wage. And they can do that for a number of reasons. If wages are high, that's going to create higher worker motivation. So workers are going to feel more valued and be more productive in theory. It's going to reduce labour turnover. With higher wages, workers are less likely to leave because they're not going to be able to find so many wages elsewhere. And labour turnover is really expensive. Hiring workers is an expensive process. And higher wages attract better workers. The best workers in an industry will only apply for the best paid jobs. And so firms offer higher wages, the workers who arrive are better. And so firms have an incentive to keep wages high in real terms. Lastly, particularly Keynesian economists would point to wage contracts as a form of real wage unemployment. It's easy to say that wages could just adjust downwards, but in the real world, even if workers are prepared to accept lower wages, if there are no trade unions, if there's a low replacement ratio, wage contracts mean that workers can't always do that. Most wage contracts last a year, so wages can't instantaneously fall. And even when contracts are renewed, if the economy is not doing so well, you'll still be reluctant as a worker to accept a lower wage for a whole year, because what if the economy recovers during that year, and that low wage now means you're underpaid? As a result, Keynes argues from wage contracts. Keynesian economists argue that labour markets don't tend to adjust. Wages are sticky, they don't adjust downwards. Both classical economists and Keynesian economists would argue that real wage unemployment exists. Unemployment in a recession in particular exists when wages don't adjust downwards. Classical economists lean on real wage unemployment, and they'd argue that real wage unemployment is the only real type of unemployment. And it's fundamentally caused by imperfections in the labour market. The market isn't able to work properly because of things like benefits, trade unions, and national minimum wages. Keynesian or interventionist economists, on the other hand, would argue that this is an inevitable feature of labour markets. Wage contracts and the efficiency wage hypothesis suggest that labour markets will rarely ever perfectly adjust. Wages don't tend to adjust downwards. And we can see that here. Classical economists, over the period 2008 to 2014, when unemployment was quite high, classical economists would look at the real wage decrease. You can see the red line dips kind of in the middle third of the diagram. They'd say that real wage decrease is evidence that the market works, it's adjusting, and therefore unemployment falls. But Keynesian economists would say, well, look, unemployment was high for 5 years, and that suggests that the market doesn't really adjust very quickly, and there needs to be government intervention. It's worth drawing the link between real wage unemployment and cyclical unemployment. The key idea is that real wage unemployment isn't a different cause of unemployment, it's not a new cause of unemployment, it's just a different perspective. And we can see that because we can see that cyclical unemployment is really just a type of real wage unemployment. Remember, cyclical unemployment is when demand for labour falls in a recession because firms are producing fewer goods. But that only causes unemployment if real wages don't adjust. We know what happens with cyclical unemployment in an ADAS diagram. Go back to the video on cyclical unemployment, the last video, if you're unsure. But let's see what's happening in the labour market. When a recession hits, firms end up producing fewer goods, so demand for labour falls. Now, in a perfect world, the wage would fall, the quantity of workers would contract to L1, that should say L2, shouldn't it? And as a result, there's no unemployment. The labour market's still in equilibrium. But in reality, what tends to happen is wages don't adjust. So instead, we get this gap, this unemployment gap, because the demand for workers contracts, but the supply of workers stays the same. And that unemployment is cyclical unemployment, but it's also real wage unemployment. And again, classical economists would say that this failure to adjust is due to market imperfections, too much intervention. Keynesians would argue that it's an inevitable feature of labour markets and governments need to intervene to solve this problem. This is one of the most complex links to make within the unemployment topic, the idea of real wage unemployment and the link to cyclical unemployment. But if we can understand it, we've really got to grips with what's going on in the unemployment topic. These labour market diagrams are a little bit tricky, they're a little bit new. They link to some of the concepts in the Year 13 microeconomics course. If you're unsure, rewatch these last few minutes again. But don't worry if this concept of real wage unemployment isn't totally certain. The level at which we're dealing with this material is beyond what we'll usually need to know. But if we understand it, we're going to really be secure in our knowledge. In the exam, we might well see a question like this where we have to explain the causes of real wage unemployment. And we just go through those 5 main causes we discussed earlier. So we've spoken about real wage unemployment. Let's whiz through some of these other terms. They're going to be a bit quicker because we've actually met them before. Let's start with the idea of disequilibrium and equilibrium unemployment. Equilibrium in the labour market occurs when average wages in the market are such that the number of workers willing to work at that wage is the same as the number of employers looking for workers. In other words, the labour market's in equilibrium. There's no workers who can't find a job, there's no employers who can't find workers. Now, disequilibrium unemployment occurs when the market is in disequilibrium, when this isn't the case, when there's too many people willing to work. The number of workers wishing to work is greater than the number of employers looking for workers. That's just real wage unemployment. We've already met that. Real wages are too high. Equilibrium unemployment is the level of unemployment remaining when the market is in equilibrium. And this is a little bit trickier. It's driven by the difference between the labour supply and the labour force. Here's where it gets complex. The labour force is the number of workers looking for work in an economy. Remember our definition, it's the number of workers who are willing and able to work. The labour supply is the number of workers willing to work at the market wage. Here's how to think of the distinction. Imagine a job centre. Both our labour force and our labour supply, they're in the job centre. But only our labour supply is actually applying for jobs. So in our labour force, there's our labour supply, the workers actually applying for jobs, but there's also a group of workers who are looking for work, but aren't actually applying for the jobs at the market wage. And that's due partially to structural unemployment, when the wage is too low to incentivise workers to be mobile, and frictional unemployment, when workers have a high reservation wage, higher than the market wage. And that gap, that difference between the workers who aren't applying for jobs at the market wage, that is our natural rate of unemployment. Let's show that on a diagram in order to get our heads around it. So here's a labour market. Again, it's in equilibrium, W1 and L1. W1 is our equilibrium wage. The number of people wanting to work at W1 is the same as the number of employers wanting to hire workers. So we're in equilibrium. But there's still some workers who are in this market who are looking for a higher wage. And that's represented by the purple line, the labour force. At W1, there's a group of workers who aren't applying for jobs because they would like a higher wage. And that means we've still got some unemployment in the market, even when the market's in equilibrium. And that is equilibrium unemployment, and we call it our natural rate of unemployment. It's the level of unemployment that exists when the market's in equilibrium. It's also known as full employment. It's caused by frictional unemployment because some of those groups aren't applying for jobs, they've got a high reservation wage. It's also caused by structural unemployment. Some of those workers aren't applying for jobs because W1, although they're willing to work for that wage, they're in the wrong industry. And W1 isn't high enough to justify them being mobile. Perhaps that's moving house to where the jobs are, or changing industry and retraining. Again, this diagram is one of the nicest in the course for explaining this concept. If we drop it into an exam answer, we're able to show with real fluency that we understand. But this natural rate of unemployment idea is really complex. I've gone through it quite quickly, so again, pause the video, rewind a bit, go back through this stuff to make sure we've got the cool concepts. The natural rate of unemployment is the same as equilibrium unemployment. It's the amount of unemployment we get when the market is in equilibrium, because there are some workers who are not applying for jobs at that wage, but they're still looking for work. Once you're happy with the concept, given that the natural rate of unemployment is driven by frictional and structural unemployment, and we've met them before, pause the video and have a think how many factors you can think of that are going to affect the natural rate of unemployment. You might want to write them down. Pause the video and have a think. Well, the natural rate of unemployment is frictional and structural, so there's a bunch of things. We can talk about benefits driving frictional unemployment, remember the replacement ratio. Similarly, income taxes affecting disposable income out of work. Information is going to be really important. How available is the information on jobs? All of those are going to drive frictional unemployment. But things like training and education, the housing market, transport, the provision of government jobs and internet connectivity, all of those are starting to drive structural unemployment. These are factors which affect immobility of labour. If we provide, for instance, more, if we fix the housing market, it might affect geographic mobility. We need to be happy with some of the big things that might affect the natural rate of unemployment. But we're going to come back to those things when we think about how unemployment interacts with inflation. Okay, so looking through our key terms, we've spoken about equilibrium, disequilibrium, natural rate and real wage unemployment. Just a couple of terms left to get our heads around. Now, these terms are slightly controversial, but lots of economists use the term voluntary unemployment. Now, involuntary unemployment is any unemployment caused by market conditions outside the control of workers. So we're thinking cyclical unemployment, unemployment where it's just not my fault, there just aren't enough jobs in the economy. But voluntary unemployment is unemployment which is in some sense the fault of workers. Workers have made a choice that leads to unemployment. Now, a common mistake that people get is that it's not the workers are just choosing not to work. It's that workers make a choice that leads to unemployment. That choice might be very sensible. It might be that they're choosing to look for a higher wage. It might be that they're choosing not to change industries or choosing not to move house. That choice might not be irrational. Take, for example, housing. Suppose a worker loses a job in the northeast of the country, of the UK. Imagine that worker has a family and they live in a fairly large house. Now, that person might be able to find a job in the south of England, perhaps in Oxford. But the house price differential means that if they were to sell their 4-bedroom house in the north, they might only be able to buy a 2-bed flat in Oxford. Now, it's true that they could do that, but with a family, that might be a terrible idea. So we'd still consider that voluntary unemployment because they're still choosing not to make that switch. But we're not saying it's not a very sensible choice. Voluntary unemployment, therefore, is the same as the natural rate. Because we're thinking frictional unemployment, where workers choose not to apply for jobs because they're looking for better working conditions or they have a higher reservation wage, but also structural unemployment because workers are choosing not to be mobile. But again, that might be a sensible choice. And so it's also equilibrium unemployment. Frictional unemployment, they're choosing not to accept a lower wage. Structural, they're choosing not to retrain or to move. Lastly, let's just quickly meet these terms: demand and supply side unemployment, just to finish our overview. We like talking about employment as about the demand side or the supply side of the economy. Demand side, we're thinking cyclical unemployment. It's when unemployment is caused by a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. That's cyclical unemployment. Supply side unemployment, on the other hand, is just our natural rate of unemployment. It's when unemployment is caused by problems with the workers rather than with the demand for labour. So it might be that workers are supplying their labour to the wrong industries, structural unemployment, or they have a particularly high reservation wage. So just to go back to our overview, there's a bunch of key terms we need to be happy with how they fit together. Here's our framework. This is one to memorise. And if you've got any questions about any of these, go back through the video and look through these key terms, because if we can get our heads around what's on the screen right now, we've absolutely nailed unemployment. It's a really tricky concept to get our heads around. There's lots of things going on. And what makes life difficult is that there's an awful lot of misinformation, particularly on the internet, about how these terms fit together. But this video hopefully is a really good and helpful overview of how they work, which means that we won't be thrown by any questions using these different terms. Lastly, let me just walk you through some of the ways what we've looked at in this video might appear in the exam. The main application is going to be 9 or 15 markers in the AQA syllabus. So 15 markers are explain questions. So we might see something like explain the main demand and supply side causes of unemployment. Well, that gives us 2 points. Point 1, demand side, that's cyclical unemployment. And point 2, supply side, that's our natural rate, and we can explain that. Or explain the main determinants of the natural rate of unemployment. Well, we can break that down into frictional and structural and go through what we know determines those. Check out the last video if you're unsure. Or perhaps thirdly, explain the meaning of voluntary unemployment and the factors that determine it. And again, tricky question, but voluntary unemployment we know is just structural and frictional, and so we can just explain why those are voluntary and then go through what determines them. If we understand this broad framework of how these unemployment terms fit together, we'll see that these kinds of questions are not as difficult as they seem.